Snow covered the wide Wyoming plains like a thick white blanket, and the wind moved through the fields with a deep, endless sound. Ethan Cole stood by the window of his small wooden ranch house, watching the storm grow stronger by the minute. The horses were restless in the barn, and even the dogs refused to leave the porch. It was the kind of night when no one should be outside. He turned back toward the fire, planning to add more wood before turning in for the night, when something caught his eye, a dark shape moving in the distance. At first, he thought it was his eyes playing tricks on him. But then the shape staggered, almost falling, and Ethan realized it was a person. He quickly grabbed his coat, hat, and lantern, stepping out into the bitter wind. The cold bit at his face as he trudged through the snow, each step sinking deep. The storm made it hard to see, but he kept the lantern high and shouted, "Hey, you there! You all right?" There was no answer, only the sound of the wind. When he got closer, he saw a woman, soaked through, her clothes thin and torn, her face pale from cold and exhaustion. She looked like she had been walking for hours. Her lips trembled as she tried to speak, but no sound came out. Ethan didn't waste time. He slipped one arm under her shoulders and lifted her carefully. She was light, too light, like she hadn't eaten properly in days. "Easy now," he said softly. "You're safe. Let's get you out of this cold." He carried her inside the house and laid her on the old leather couch near the fire. The warmth began to touch her skin, and her shaking slowed a little. Ethan knelt beside her and removed his gloves. Her hands were ice cold. He rubbed them gently to bring back warmth, then took a blanket from the chair and wrapped it around her. She blinked weakly and whispered, "Please, don't send me away." Her voice was soft, broken. Ethan looked at her with calm eyes. "No one's sending you anywhere," he said kindly. "You're safe here." He poured a cup of hot tea and held it near her lips. She hesitated, then took a sip, coughing as the heat hit her throat. Color slowly returned to her cheeks. She looked around the room, confused and tired. The place was simple. Wood walls, old furniture, and a few pictures of horses and wide-open fields. "What's your name?" Ethan asked. She looked down, avoiding his eyes. "Grace," she said after a pause. "My name's Grace." "All right, Grace, I'm Ethan. You can rest here until you're feeling better. There's no one else around for miles, so you're safe." Tears filled her eyes, but she quickly looked away, embarrassed. "You don't understand," she murmured. "I'm filthy, inside and out." Ethan frowned slightly. "You've been through something, haven't you?" She didn't answer. Instead, she turned her face toward the fire and closed her eyes, her expression filled with exhaustion. Ethan didn't press her. He knew when a person had carried too much pain to speak, so he simply nodded and went to the kitchen to prepare soup. While he cooked, he kept glancing at her. She was young, maybe 30, maybe younger, but her face carried the weight of someone much older. Her clothes were covered in dirt and torn at the edges. Her shoes were soaked through and her hands were scratched. She must have walked miles through the storm. When the soup was ready, he set the bowl near her and told her to eat when she could. Then he sat in his armchair and stared into the fire, thinking. It had been a long time since anyone had come this way. The ranch sat on the edge of nowhere, surrounded by plains that stretched endlessly. He had chosen it that way after losing his wife years ago. Solitude had become his comfort, his quiet way of dealing with grief. But tonight, with this stranger asleep near his fire, the silence felt different. Not empty, but alive. Hours later, Grace stirred. Ethan looked up from his chair. She whispered something in her sleep, her face tightening as if from a bad dream. He stood quietly, pulled the blanket higher over her shoulders, and noticed something that made him pause. The blanket had slipped down her arm, revealing bruises, dark, old, and fading, mixed with fresh ones. His jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He knew that kind of pain didn't come from falling or working. It came from someone's hands. The next morning, the storm had calmed, leaving the land silent under a bright sky. Ethan stepped outside early to check the animals. The cold air stung his lungs, but the sight of sunlight breaking through clouds felt good. When he returned, Grace was sitting on the couch, staring at the fire. Her hair, though tangled, caught the light, and her eyes looked clearer than before. "You should eat," he said gently. "You need strength." She nodded and took the bowl of oatmeal he offered. She ate slowly, quietly. After a long silence, she said, "I'm sorry for coming here. I didn't mean to cause trouble." Ethan smiled slightly. "You didn't cause any trouble. No one deserves to be left out there in that cold." Grace looked down at her hands. "I'll leave once the road clears." He hesitated, then said, You can stay as long as you need. There's plenty of work if you want to help." She looked surprised. "Work? Feeding the animals, cleaning the barn, simple things. You don't owe me anything, but work can help you think less." For the first time, a faint smile touched her lips. "I can do that." From that day, Grace began helping around the ranch. She was quiet, but her hands were steady and capable. She brushed the horses, gathered eggs, and even learned to milk the cows. Ethan watched her slowly change. Her shoulders straightened, her eyes brightened, and she began humming softly when she worked. Still, there were moments when she froze suddenly, as if remembering something painful. Once, when a thunderclap echoed in the distance, she dropped a bucket and trembled uncontrollably. Ethan didn't ask questions. He simply picked up the bucket, said nothing, and went on working beside her. Evenings were calm. They would eat together, sometimes in silence, sometimes with small talk. Ethan learned she liked the sound of rain but hated closed doors. She never spoke about her past, but her eyes said enough. One night, as the wind picked up again, she asked, "Do you ever get lonely here?" Ethan thought for a moment. "Used to. But after a while, the quiet feels like company." She nodded. "I wish I could feel that." He smiled faintly. "You will. Takes time." As days turned into weeks, the snow began to melt. Grace was stronger now, her cheeks pink from work in the cold air. The ranch looked brighter somehow, as if her presence had brought a piece of life back into it. Then one morning, everything changed. Ethan was repairing a fence when he saw a dark truck parked on the far road. It didn't belong to anyone he knew. The vehicle was too clean, too new for ranch country. A man stood beside it wearing a black coat and sunglasses, even though the sun was weak. He looked out toward the ranch for a long time, then turned back to his truck and drove away slowly. Ethan watched until the truck disappeared behind the hills. He felt something uneasy in his chest. When he returned to the house, Grace was in the kitchen drying dishes. But when she saw his face, her hands froze mid-air. "What's wrong?" she asked quietly. "There was a truck out by the road," he said. "Black one. Didn't look like someone from around here." Her face drained of color. The plate slipped from her hands and shattered on the floor. Ethan stepped forward instinctively. "Grace?" She shook her head quickly, backing away from the broken pieces. "No, it can't be. He wouldn't come here." "Who?" Ethan asked softly. She didn't answer. Her breathing quickened and tears filled her eyes. "Please, Ethan," she said, her voice trembling. "If anyone comes asking about me, tell them you haven't seen me." Ethan could see the terror in her eyes, the kind that didn't come from imagination. He nodded slowly. "You're safe here, Grace, I promise." But she turned away, staring out the window toward the road as if expecting that truck to return any second. That night, Grace didn't eat. She sat near the fire, wrapped in the same old blanket, her eyes distant. Ethan watched her for a long time. She looked smaller now, like she was folding in on herself. Finally, he said quietly, "Whoever's out there, they won't get through me." Grace looked at him, tears sliding down her cheeks. "You don't know what kind of man he is." Ethan leaned forward, his voice calm but firm. "I know what kind of man I am, and I won't let anyone hurt someone under my roof." Her lips trembled, and for the first time she let herself cry openly. The storm outside began again, wind tapping at the windows. Ethan added more wood to the fire, then quietly sat beside her until she fell asleep. When he finally stood to cover her with the blanket again, he saw the same old bruises on her arms, but this time, he noticed more, faint scars across her wrist, the kind that told a longer story of suffering and endurance. His hands tightened slightly, not in anger at her, but at whoever had done this. He whispered under his breath, "You're safe now. No one's taking that from you." As the firelight flickered on her face, the storm outside raged harder. But inside that small wooden house, there was warmth, not just from the fire, but from something unspoken. For the first time in years, Ethan felt like his home was more than wood and stone again. The next morning, he woke before dawn, looked out at the horizon, and saw new tire tracks near the road. Someone had been there again during the night. He knew things were about to change, and that the peace they had found was only the calm before the truth came crashing through the quiet plains. The morning air was cold and quiet, but something felt wrong the moment Ethan stepped outside. The tracks near the road were fresh, deep tire marks pressed into the soft snow. Whoever had been there last night had stopped close enough to watch the house. Ethan followed the tracks with his eyes until they disappeared over the rise of a nearby hill. A sense of unease crawled through his chest. Inside the house, Grace was already awake. She was sitting by the window, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had gone cold. She looked pale, her eyes red from another sleepless night. When Ethan entered, she looked up, trying to force a small smile. "Did you sleep at all?" he asked quietly. She shook her head. "No, I kept thinking I heard something outside." Ethan nodded slowly. Someone was out there. A truck came by again before dawn. The color drained from her face. She set down the cup and looked toward the door, her fingers trembling slightly. "He found me," she whispered. "I knew he would." "Grace," Ethan said gently, "you need to tell me who's after you. I can't help you if I don't know." She took a deep breath, fighting the tears threatening to rise. Her voice trembled when she finally spoke. "His name is Marcus. He's my husband, or was." Ethan froze for a second. "Was? I left him 3 months ago," she said. "He wasn't what people thought. Everyone in town called him generous, charming, successful. But behind closed doors, he was cruel. When I tried to leave, he used his money and power to make sure no one would believe me. He told the police I'd stolen from him, that I was unstable. I ran, Ethan. I didn't take a thing. I just wanted to live." Her voice broke at the end and she covered her face with her hands. Ethan stepped closer but didn't touch her. He just stood nearby, his voice calm and steady. "You did what you had to do. You survived." She looked up, tears streaking down her cheeks. "You don't understand. He has friends in every county around here. He'll make sure I disappear before anyone questions his story." Ethan's expression hardened. "Not while you're here. Not while I'm breathing." Grace wanted to believe him, but fear was carved too deep inside her. Every creak of the wooden floor made her flinch. Every passing truck on the distant road made her go still. Ethan could see how much the past had scarred her, not just in her body, but in her heart. Later that day, a dark cloud gathered over the mountains. The sky dimmed, and the wind carried the scent of another storm. Ethan worked quietly, preparing the ranch in case they got snowed in again. Grace helped him bring the animals into shelter. Though her hands shook, she worked hard, refusing to hide inside. It was as if she was fighting her fear by moving forward step by step. When the last horse was safe inside the barn, she turned to Ethan. "Why are you helping me? You don't even know me." Ethan took off his hat and looked at her with quiet honesty. "Because I've been where you are. When my wife died, people told me to move on. But no one saw what I went through inside. Pain doesn't always show on the outside. I won't turn away someone who's been through it." Grace looked down, silent for a moment. "You're a good man, Ethan," he smiled faintly. "Just a man doing what's right." That evening, the storm arrived early. Snow began to fall again, heavy and wet, tapping against the windows. The fire burned strong in the hearth, filling the small house with warmth and light. Grace sat near the fire while Ethan made dinner. For the first time in days, she looked almost calm. She even laughed softly when one of the dogs tried to sneak bread off the table. But peace didn't last. Just as they finished eating, a sharp knock echoed through the house. Ethan froze. Grace's spoon slipped from her hand and clattered against the bowl. Her eyes filled with dread. Ethan stood and motioned for her to stay quiet. He went to the door and looked through the small window. A man stood outside, tall, clean-shaven, wearing a dark coat dusted with snow. His truck idled behind him. He looked too polished to be a rancher. Ethan opened the door just enough to speak. "Evening." The man tipped his hat slightly. "Evening. Sorry to bother you. Name's Sheriff Lyman from Jackson County. I'm looking for a woman who might have come through here a few days ago. Name's Grace Thompson." Ethan's jaw tightened. "What for?" "She's wanted for questioning," the man said smoothly. "There's been a theft from her husband's estate. We've got reason to believe she's hiding somewhere in this area." Ethan studied him carefully. Something about the man's eyes didn't sit right. Too cold, too certain. He looked more like a hunter than a lawman. "I haven't seen anyone," Ethan said. "Storms kept most folks away." The sheriff nodded slowly but didn't leave. "Mind if I take a look around?" "Just doing my job." Ethan stepped forward slightly, blocking the doorway. "I do mind. You don't have a warrant and this isn't your county. Now, if you've got business, you can bring proper papers next time." The man's polite smile faded. "You sure you want to play it that way, Cowboy?" Ethan's tone didn't change. "I'm sure." For a long moment, neither moved. Snow drifted between them, silent and heavy. Finally, the man smirked and stepped back. All right then. But if she shows up, you'd better tell me. Wouldn't want to get in trouble for harboring a fugitive. He turned and walked back to his truck. The engine roared, and the headlights swept across the house before disappearing into the night. Ethan closed the door and locked it. When he turned around, Grace was standing there, pale and trembling. That wasn't a sheriff, was it? She whispered. Ethan shook his head slowly. No, he was lying. Grace sank onto the chair, holding her head in her hands. He sent someone. Marcus sent him. Ethan walked over, crouched beside her, and spoke softly. You're safe here. The storm's too strong for anyone to come back tonight. She looked up, tears glistening in her eyes. You should have told him I was here. He'll come back. He'll hurt you too. Ethan's voice stayed calm but firm. I've lived through worse. Let him try. Hours passed. The storm grew louder, wind screaming through the cracks in the windows. Grace couldn't sleep. Every shadow looked like a threat, every sound like footsteps. Ethan stayed awake too, sitting near the door with his lantern beside him. The dogs lay quietly at his feet, their ears alert. Around midnight, a sound broke through the storm, the distant growl of an engine. Ethan stood instantly, moving to the window. Headlights cut through the falling snow, growing closer. Grace gasped. He's back. Ethan turned to her. Go to the cellar now. She hesitated. Ethan, go. His tone was steady, commanding. Grace nodded, grabbed her blanket and hurried toward the small door in the floor near the pantry. Ethan waited until she disappeared down the steps and quietly closed the latch. Then he blew out the lamp and waited in the dark. The truck stopped outside. The door opened. Footsteps crunched on the snow. Then came a loud bang on the front door. Open up, Cole, a deep voice shouted. I know she's in there. Ethan didn't answer. The man banged again, harder this time. You think you can hide her from me? She's mine. That single word, mine, made Ethan's chest tighten. It wasn't the voice of someone looking for justice. It was the voice of someone who wanted control. Finally, Ethan opened the door. The wind burst in, carrying snow across the floor. Marcus stood there, tall, broad-shouldered, his expensive coat gleaming even in the storm. Behind him stood the fake sheriff. Ethan didn't step aside. You've got the wrong place, Marcus sneered. I've got the right one. She's here. I can smell her perfume. Ethan's face stayed calm. You need to leave. Marcus took a step forward, but Ethan didn't move. His eyes were steady, unshaken. The dogs growled low beside him, teeth bared. The fake sheriff muttered, He's not bluffing, sir. We should go. But Marcus ignored him. You think you can stop me, rancher? He spat. You have no idea who I am. Ethan's voice was quiet but sharp as ice. I know exactly who you are. A man who can't stand losing control. But tonight you don't have it. For a moment, Marcus looked ready to lunge, but something in Ethan's eyes stopped him. The storm roared behind them, wind howling like the land itself had turned against him. Finally, Marcus stepped back, his lips curling into a cold smile. This isn't over, he said. She'll come back. They always do. Not this time, Ethan replied. Marcus turned and walked toward his truck, his boots crunching in the snow. The false sheriff followed, glancing back once with a nervous look. The truck's headlights cut across the yard, then vanished into the darkness. Ethan stood there for a long moment, watching the road until the only sound left was the wind. Then he closed the door, locked it, and went to the cellar. He lifted the latch and looked down. Grace was crouched at the bottom, her eyes wide with fear. When she saw his face, she began to cry softly, not from fear but from relief. He's gone, Ethan said quietly. You're safe. She came up slowly, shaking. Her knees almost gave out, but Ethan caught her before she fell. For a moment, she just stood there in his arms, trembling. You shouldn't have done that, she whispered. He could have killed you. Ethan shook his head. He didn't, and he won't. Grace pulled away slightly, looking up at him through tears. You don't understand, Ethan. He ruined everything I had. My family, my name, my life. He took everything from me. Ethan looked at her, steady and kind. Then let's start again. Right here. You're not who he says you are. She tried to speak, but emotion caught in her throat. The blanket around her shoulders slipped, and Ethan saw the faint scars across her skin, marks of years of pain and fear. But he didn't see shame.